Hey there, I'm Adrienne, transformation coach and your go-to gal for navigating grief and loss. On this show, we're not shying away from tough conversations. Let's talk about how we're really feeling and how to show up in our lives even though so many hard things have happened. Loss and grief are tough topics, but witnessing each other's pain and getting really honest about what we want our lives to look like in our next chapter is the way forward. You're not broken. You deserve happiness. And even though you might not think that's possible, or even feel like your life is over, I'm here to show you that you can feel peace, purpose, and joy again. Let's talk about all things change, loss, and grief, and how to move forward so we can create a life we love. Welcome to the Living with Loss podcast. Hey there, welcome back to Living with Loss. Today I have a very special guest for you. I am going to be sitting down with Clarissa Moll. Clarissa Moll is an award-winning writer and podcaster who helps bereaved people find flourishing after loss. Clarissa's writing appears in Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, Relevant, Modern Loss, Grief Digest, and more. She co-hosted Christianity Today's Surprised by Grief podcast and produces Christianity Today's flagship news podcast, The Bulletin. Clarissa's debut book, Beyond the Darkness, A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss, was a best-selling new release in 2022. She is the author of the Beyond the Darkness devotional, Heartfelt, Hope, A Real Conversation About Teen Grief and Life After Loss, and Hope Comes to Stay, which will be released in 2025. I truly enjoyed my conversation with Clarissa. Her wisdom and vulnerability shine through as she shared her insights on navigating grief, supporting teens, and embracing hope after loss. This is a discussion full of depth and compassion that I believe will resonate with anyone facing grief, especially grief with teens. Without further ado, I bring on Clarissa Moll. Hello, welcome back to Living with Loss. I'm Adrienne, and I have a very special guest with me today. I have Clarissa Moll. My gosh, Clarissa, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Or Adrienne,
Oh,
I'm sorry. There we go.
oh. No worries. For anyone that might not know you in my audience, would you mind just starting off with sharing a little bit about your personal journey, the loss of your husband, Rob? And I know that was a massive catalyst to kind of reshape your life. So if we could start there.
Yeah,
No
sure.
pressure, not a small topic.
No, well, loss marks a person indelibly. And I think for anybody who has lost a loved one, you think of your life as sort of like a BCAD. Like there's this point in time where everything is measured before or after your person died. And certainly that's been the case for me since my husband, Rob, died. 2019. He died in a hiking accident on our family vacation. So it was sudden, unexpected. We were 3,000 miles from home when we lost him. And so that's how I think about my life now. I think about the life that was before our 17 years of marriage, the 4 kids that we conceived and raised together. I think about my life as a homeschooling mom, as a communications consultant. And then I think about my life now, which is a remarried widow. I have a family, a blended family of 9 now. So it is wild and crazy and loud and complicated and good,
Mhm.
and not at all what I ever imagined it to be. I'm a bereavement advocate now. I am a podcaster and writer. And so, in many ways, my life has changed a lot since that catalyst moment of Rob's death. But I'm still the same person inside. A lot of me has changed and developed, matured, I hope, over time. But there are many ways. I'm still the girl who likes to sleep in late on a Saturday morning, who wants to order out for pizza on a Friday night because I don't want to cook. There are certain things like that that I think never changed despite the major shift in my life that has come with loss.
I think that's a really great point to start with, that grief does change us, but maintaining that essence of who you are. And it can be so challenging during it, but it's awesome to hear that, like you still love this, a lot of the same things that you did before. And it sounds like you're thriving in life now. Like your life is very different, but like you said, in a very good way. So that's exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that, for a lot of people who have not lost a loved one, they anticipate that after the rawest portion of your grief, that you are always progressing toward a new normal, and that new normal is symbolized by less crying, no more pain, perhaps lack of difficulties, mental health difficulties like anxiety or depression in your life. But none of those things are actually true. As you've lived with loss, you discover that all of the same struggles that you had before are struggles that you continue to have. And that while your life grows around the loss that you experienced, it still is a source of pain for you. It's still a source of frustration sometimes, of anger, of sadness, and really the task of living life after loss is learning to balance that need for honesty and the depth of those emotions with a life that draws you forward. So it's always a work, it's an endeavor, it's a
Mhm.
journey. It's definitely not 5, 7 stages that you work through and then you get your certificate of completion at the end.
Isn't that the truth? And you're an author, like you said, podcaster, a bereavement advocate. Through all of that, what inspired you to start helping others through their grief or understanding their grief?
Well, my husband actually, before his death in 2019, had written a book for people who were dying and for the families who were
Mhm.
supporting them. He had worked in a funeral home and he had worked the night shift there. He had worked as a hospice volunteer. And he saw that our modern ways of dying, that often were sequestered in hospitals, highly intervening as far as medical procedures, really made it difficult for families to do the important work of community life surrounding a person who is dying. And so he wrote this book, The Art of Dying, living fully into the life to come out of that experience. And after his death, it just seemed a natural kind of reflective measure to continue that work, to say, okay, well, you prepared people for death. What do we do with the people who are left? And so my work began reflecting on his life. I wrote a new afterword for his book that was published after his death, and that really began a journey for me into what did it look like to equip people to grieve well. We had taught them to die well. Now, what do we do to help them grieve well? Because whether or not you believe it after your person has died, you still have a whole lot of life left ahead of you, and I want to live it well.
That is so beautiful. What was it like to have his book after he died, being able to read his words and talking about death in that way?
I feel like it was such a great gift. Every person who dies leaves something behind. And whether it's dad's old pair of work boots that you just can't seem to part with, you keep in the closet even though he's long gone, whether it's a quilt that grandma made, we all have things that are precious to us that bear the fingerprints of our loved ones, bear their thoughts, their intentionality. And so I see Rob's books as that for me. These were his last love letters to me, to our children, to the world, and it's a great comfort to be able to hold those in my hands.
I could see how having that would be such a gift. I would imagine challenging at
Yeah.
times, but that really is amazing that you do have that. So, your first book was Beyond the Darkness, A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss. What led you to decide to write that and
Mm.
structure it the way you did?
Well, I come from a faith tradition. I'm a Christian. And so I was looking for practical grief support that would also acknowledge the very soul depth kind of work that happens after someone we love has died. Um, I want to know what's happening with my body, what's happening with my emotions. And I know that a lot of grieving people are too. They want to understand this strange landscape that they've been dropped into where relationships seem different and their eating habits seem different. But I think a lot of us are also asking really important soul level questions. Where's my person beyond just cremated in an urn or buried in the ground? Is God real? Why do bad things happen to good people? All of these things were things that I that I knew were important questions to ask. And while many grief and bereavement resources sort of separate those two, there'll be books that are really great on practical support, or books that are great on a meditative sort of devotional level for people who are asking those questions. I don't see life as so compartmentalized as that. I think that, when my body is weary, those are the moments I actually start asking those big life questions. So I really wanted to pair all of that practical support with the deeper conversations about spirituality, because I think that's kind of how we live our lives, a mishmash of all of the little and big things that we're wrestling with after someone that we love dies.
I love that. And I think, at least for myself too, as I've gone through grief and my mom has lung cancer now, while I walk through that, those big questions are at the front of
Mhm.
my mind. It's almost that false sense of control trying to make sense of things that you can't make sense of. And logically, I understand
Mhm.
that, but that doesn't prevent those questions from being top of mind. And you're right, it very much is interwoven with the grieving process. You can't really have one without the other.
That's so true.
Writing the newest book with your daughter, and we'll talk about that, the book that you've already written. What have been some of the biggest challenges in writing about your loss experience or speaking about it in public? I would imagine there's probably an empowering piece to it, and it could be incredibly emotionally challenging and draining at times as well.
Yeah, it certainly has both of those components. I think the biggest challenge is that we live in a culture where hashtag oversharing is a very normal part of public discourse. So we are used to TikTok videos of, what we call ugly crying. We have tell-all biographies. We just put ourselves out there in a way that is very vulnerable and very transparent. And I think one of the things that you realize after you experience a death of a loved one is that, in as much as you want other people to know your story, to understand your pain, there are some experiences within that loss that are very raw and sacred. They have a privacy that you desire for them, that because they're just so tender. And I think as I've learned to navigate my life in the public eye, as I've written about my loss, that has been the biggest challenge for me. Figuring out what does my audience need to hear? What should remain sacred? What do I do when people ask questions that I don't want to answer, that I don't feel comfortable answering? And as I talk to grieving people, it's kind of amazing that this isn't just like a writer's problem. This is a problem that a lot of people intersect with. My landscaper came over and he asked, "How did my mom die?" I don't want to talk about that on my front lawn. What do I do? And I think we're not particularly equipped in our culture to create healthy boundaries around communication, around sharing. We've been taught somehow over time that telling it all is the most authentic way to be. But when it comes to really painful experiences in your life, I think there's a lot of wisdom to be learned and practiced in determining what parts of your story to share with particular groups of people. There are people in my life who know every terrifying and terrible detail about my loss of Rob and about the life that we have lived since then. And there are other people who only know a sliver that is important to where they're at that particular time. And so it's my duty as a writer, as a speaker, to show up authentically so that anyone who ever met me would say, "Yeah, that's the person that I know." And yet there's also varying levels of intimacy in all of those kind of conversations.
I found that having a plan for myself, and I know you
Yes.
can't possibly cover all of the awkward, uncomfortable situations that could come up, but kind of knowing in advance at least some of what I'm willing to share, depending on the level of relationship I have with that person, has been helpful. Has there been a rule of thumb that you've had for yourself? So if somebody listening is like, I get these questions, I freeze up, I don't know what to do, how you navigate that territory?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I really quickly talked to my kids about after Rob's death, and I think it's instructive for kids and adults alike. I told them it's okay to say no. It is okay to say, "I'm not comfortable talking about that," and we would just sort of practice that as our stock phrase. I'm not comfortable talking about that. So if you were at youth group or soccer practice and someone asked you a question about dad and you didn't want to say anything or you weren't sure what to say, here, I've just given you the line. I'm not comfortable talking about that. And most of the time, most people will take the cue that, okay, don't push any further, you know, but we would talk through that. Okay, after you've given your line, if they keep pressing, then you just say, "Excuse me, I need to go now," and extricate yourself from that conversation, and all of that is okay. But I think, at the beginning, we do need some of those memorized lines to help us out
Yeah.
because, like you say, we're sort of dumbstruck, like, did this person really just ask this question? Or, uh, I can't believe that you would ask it here in this particular setting, and so having a line on hand, "I'm not comfortable talking about that," or, "Excuse me, I need to go now," can be a really helpful first step in developing the kind of, brain mechanisms that you need to be able to handle those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I love that line. I'm not comfortable talking about that.
Mhm.
It's simple, it's easy to remember, and you can kind of use it across the board as you need
Yeah.
it. It's great for kids too, like you said,
Mhm.
kids, teenagers, if they're kind of in that, like, I don't know where to go with this. Just
Yeah.
break that line out. And like you said, most people are respectful and understand. Let's leave it there.
Yeah.
So navigating this with children and then opening up yourself to love again, I would imagine there were a lot of difficult emotions or challenges that you encountered during the process. How did that play out as far as helping the kids understand what this was like, or with talking to them about it?
Yeah, it's challenging when you're parenting children through grief, through a shared loss, because you have your own grief that you need to carry, and you also need to shepherd them through the process. You can't take away their grief, and you pretty quickly realize that. But you do have a responsibility as the adult in the room to be a shepherd, to gently guide them toward whatever it is they need, whether it's authentic expressions of emotion or brave steps forward or whatever that is. And so I think for me the balance has always been, how do I take care of myself, and when I've taken care of myself, in the process of taking care of myself, what do I need to offer to my children? So I think of two questions: what do they want to know, and what do they need to know? It's important to me that my kids are equipped with age appropriate information about Rob's death, about what grief is, about loss. And sometimes they don't want to know those things. And so I have to very delicately think through, okay, is this information that they need to know right now? Or do I have a desire to let them know? And if it's all on me, if it's my desire, maybe I need to be a student of them and wait for a better time. And a lot of that is the posture of attentive listening, about curious observation. It's a realization that when it comes to grief, we are all muddling our way through. We're all learning
Yes.
as we go, and to some extent, I have to trust my child's instinctual wisdom in this situation in a way that I perhaps never had. When I'm potty training, I am less likely to trust my child's instinctual wisdom. I say,
Mm.
"I know you don't need to go to the bathroom, but we're gonna go anyways before we leave," right? And so it's a
Mhm.
very sharp pivot for a lot of parents to move from the "I know what's best for my child" to the "let my child share what's best for them," and create an environment where they feel comfortable sharing that. But when it comes to grief, I think there is an innate wisdom that our children have, that we really have to honor and we have to listen to, while still being that shepherd, knowing that in the end, the buck stops with us. The responsibility is ours, and we have to tend that responsibility well.
Yeah, I can imagine that's challenging, but like you said, what do they need to know? What do you want to share with them? And really being attentive to what they need and what is responsible to share as well. And like you said, age appropriate. You said thinking about what you need as well in this
Mhm.
process. And I think so many people that go through grief almost feel guilty taking care of themselves or doing things for themselves. Was this something you realized very early on? Did you have self care practices that you went to, or kind of as you, like you said, muddled through it, did you figure out, like, I'm not doing enough for me?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it is something that a lot of folks struggle with. I think for me, it required that I re envision what self care looked like. Before Rob died, self care was a Saturday morning where I slept in. He got all the kids up, he made them pancakes, and then he took them to the park. And I got to have a slow morning. I got to have my coffee. I might read a book or watch one of my guilty pleasure shows that I had to binge watch when the kids weren't around. That was self care to me. Self care was a night out with my friends. It was going to get ice cream with them and, or have a drink. But you can't do that as a single parent. It's just, you need another adult in your life to be able to create those kind of self-care rhythms with any kind of regularity. And so after Rob died, it was really a journey of discovery. Like, what does self-care look like in this season? Okay, self-care looks like a hot shower. Period. A hot
Mhm.
shower. It means having, picking something else up for myself at the grocery store, sticking a pint of ice cream in the Instacart that I can enjoy when the kids have gone to bed. It means texting with a friend while my kid is on the playground and not feeling guilty that I'm not watching them the whole time because I need that kind of care to fill my relational tanks. And I think all of those things involve letting go of some of the guilt that can often plague us, where we feel like we should be helping somebody else and we put ourselves last. But when we put ourselves last, we always end up as dry wells. You can't
Yes.
give out of an empty cup, and I think you realize that pretty quickly when you're grieving.
It can be so challenging to acknowledge that even and get past the guilt of it, but like you said, it's so necessary, especially like you had 4 kids.
Mhm.
So if you don't take care of yourself, then they're not getting all of you,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah.
So faith has been such a huge part of your journey, a part it seems like a part of your grief and a part of how you talk about it. How has that evolved for you since, like your faith before Rob died and now, or has it kind of been this continuous constant for you?
Mm. I think while there are certain core beliefs that have remained constant for me, certain things that I believe about the world, about humanity, about God, I don't find that those things have shifted so dramatically in my life. But what I have discovered is that over time, I have understood more deeply how some of these realities actually interface with my everyday life. For example, I believe that God is good and God is loving, that God takes care of those He loves. But I've actually had to rely on that wisdom, on that truth in ways that I never had to before when my husband was alive. I became the sole breadwinner overnight for my family, the sole decision maker overnight for my family. And while I like to think of myself as a capable person, it was a big shift to realize that all of the weight of the responsibility for my family now rested on me. And so when I think about my faith, I think, wow, I'm so grateful that I'm not alone in this task, that I believe that God offers wisdom, that God offers comfort, that God offers guidance. And this is where the rubber has met the road for me. So, yeah, it's all things that I believed before, but now I find that I'm leaning into those truths, those beliefs in in a way that perhaps is a little bit desperate sometimes. And I think that kind of desperation, that vulnerability is actually really beautiful because we're taught in our culture to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, to shoulder through and move on. And if you've lost a loved one, you know that those things don't actually work, that they leave you spent and absolutely and utterly alone and without resource. And so I think there's a piece of understanding that desperation, that vulnerability that has allowed me to relax into the experience of grief. Because I know that wherever I go, that I'm not alone in the hard things that I face.
That is really beautiful. It seemed like in the newest book,
Mhm.
Fiona also really leans into her faith as well. Was that challenging for your kids as they worked through it, if you're comfortable talking about that? Or was that
Yeah.
similar for them where they had that to lean
Yeah.
on?
I think that they're Any belief that we have that we acquire when we're children has a very clear black and white kind of boundaries around it. For example, we believe that bad things don't happen to good people. That if I make a good decision at school, I won't get in trouble with the teacher. Right. And we
Mhm.
have a very clear cause and effect that we teach our children because, in some sense, we want them to believe that there are reliable structures within this world that we operate. So, I teach my son when I am teaching him to drive not to speed. Why? Because he could get pulled over and there's a consequence, right? And so we have a lot of this cause and effect, black and white thinking that is an important learning tool for our children when they're young. But you throw death or grief into that, and that is just throwing a wrench into the wheel of childhood thinking. And it really makes a tangle of the ways that kids view the world, understand the world. And so I think for each of my children, the process of understanding what it means to ask faithful questions, to ask spiritual questions, to ask soul deep questions in the midst of loss, uh, it's something I wish that they could have done perhaps when they were older and more sort of developmentally equipped for those kind of conversations. And yet, I also look at them and I say, "Wow, you guys amaze me at your capacity for deep wisdom for these kind of conversations, for hard questions." And it feels in a way like an honor that I have gotten to be the person who has a front row seat.
So, hope is a theme in the new book, and I was wondering, how has hope evolved from you from the early days of your grief to where you are now?
Mm. So, in the early days of my grief, hope meant survival. I mean, it was really just a very direct hope equals survival. I wasn't sure how I would get everything done. I wasn't sure how we would survive financially or emotionally, relationally. We had only recently moved to a new home a year before, and I wasn't sure could if I could even keep my house. And so in the early days, hope was just a tenacious clinging to, are we going to make it tomorrow morning? I remember sometimes waking up in the morning and thinking, okay, we made it through the night. I'm not sure what I thought would
Mhm.
happen, but there was this sense of survival. And over time, as I've gotten my feet underneath me, as we've created new healthy rhythms for our family, we have built a foundation that is built on hope. It's built on not the pie in the sky kind of hopefulness that I think that we like to associate with hope. It's not rainbows and dreamy scenes. It is a hope that is hard won. It's a realization that the hard work that we put in has borne fruit for us in relationship, in effort, in building a life that we can really love. And so when I think about hope now, I think about there's a passage in the New Testament in Scripture that says hope doesn't disappoint, and I have come to believe that that's the sort of hopefulness I have. It's a grounded hope. It's a realization that no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay, that we're going to survive. And it's not because we're so super smart or we're such a great family or we have the ideal relationships. It's that, um, I have a faith in God that undergirds my life. I've seen the darkest part of life and I've made it through, and it's not been my own amazing superwoman strength. And I also believe in the power of community, that there are so many people that will walk with you. You kind of have to handpick them sometimes after a loss because relationships are different, but that community is a vital part of our survival. And there are moments when I look around me at our full house on Thanksgiving or Easter or Memorial Day weekend, and I say to myself, like, these people are my hope. I hope in God, and I place my hope in these people. That these people have shown up for me in the past, and I trust that in one way or another they're going to show up for me in the future. And because of those two things, I'm going to be okay, whatever happens.
That's really powerful. The idea of grounded hope. I love that because I think, especially in the very early days of grief,
Mhm.
you can't see the other side where you might feel hope or how that might evolve. And it can be such a difficult, dark place to be in, but to know that hope can still exist and it might change and how you see it, but it's there. I think the point about relationships as well, I would imagine navigating that, having children and their relationships. If you were talking to somebody going through grief and they realized some of their relationships were shifting, some people didn't know how to walk alongside them as they're in grief, or kind of want to tell them how to do it, or whatever that might look like as far as the strain in the relationship. What helped you in navigating that change in relationships?
Mm. Well, it's very difficult to see people that you thought were close kind of fade away, to feel lonely at your most vulnerable. One of the things that I realized early on was that I had asked some friends to do things that just they weren't their skill set. You think about a baseball team or a football team, and each member of the team is chosen for the team to play a certain role. The goalie doesn't score the goals, he defends the goal. The linebacker has a different job than the quarterback. And yet, when it comes to friendships, when it comes to building our team in life, we tend to think of friends as a one size fits all, that you should be good at all the things. And after loss, it can be really difficult when we want to pour out our hearts to somebody and they don't give us the kind of emotional affirmation that we're looking for. Maybe they try to fix our problem instead. Or we reach out to somebody and we want to do something with them, and they decide that they're not really interested, but they're happy to text with us, and we wonder why don't you want to get together? You seem fine on text, but you get cold feet when I ask if we can get together, and we wonder why these shifts are happening. Now, sometimes it's because our friends don't know how to engage with us after loss. That's a very real difficulty. But I'm convinced that when we ask them to engage in a place of strength, in their zone of genius, chances are they're able to interact with us in ways that actually offer us support. So, for example, if I have a friend who, we exchange recipes, we send each other Pinterest recipes or TikTok videos about great dinners that we can have with our kids. She may not be the person that I pour my heart out to when I'm having a really tough day because I've spent time talking to the bank about what to do about my mortgage and I'm overwhelmed having to do this as a single mom now. But she might be just the person to say, "Hey, would you mind making double of what you're making tonight and bringing some over for me because I'm maxed out from the day and my kids and I could use a home cooked meal." That she might be able to do in spades, but it's that I'm asking her to be a friend in her zone of genius, in the place where she actually functions well. And I think as we're looking to build community, yes, there are people who will drift away from our lives. They can't be present to us in the ways we need, and we need to grieve those things. But for those that remain, and for the holes that we discover are on our team, we can look to fill them in the ways that will actually give us the support we need, honoring their uniqueness and what they bring to our
Mhm.
lives, and allowing them to do for us what they do best.
I've never heard it explained as asking your friends in their zone of genius, and that is just such a brilliant way of putting it. One person can't be everything to somebody,
That's right.
but like you said, they've got an area where that's their thing and they're great in it, and if you're able to ask them for something in that area, of course they're going to show up, like,
Mhm.
or likely they will show up for you.
Yeah.
That is such an amazing distinction. I love that. Your upcoming book, the one I've referenced it a couple times, Hurt, Help, Hope, A Real Conversation About Teen Grief and Life After Loss, is aimed at answering questions that teens have about loss. What were some of the most common challenges that you've realized that teens are facing, especially walking through it with your own kids? And how can parents start those conversations effectively?
Mm. Well, when it comes to grief, we tend to think of those conversations with our kids like we would think about birds and the bees conversations. We're going to have one really awkward conversation with our kids. We're going to cover it in one sit down, and then hallelujah, we're going to be all done. We won't have to talk about this again. But as you know, in conversations about, adolescence or puberty and sexuality, the very best conversations with our kids take place over time. They're little snippets in the car. They're a nighttime conversation when your teen is up at 10:30 still doing homework and and suddenly wants to talk about something big and life shifting. These are conversations that are ongoing. And so when parents are interfacing with a teenager or youth leaders or coaches with a student who has lost someone that they love, I always encourage start small. Start small.
Mhm.
Make sure that you are a trustworthy person because, to your question, who can I trust is a core question that teenagers have after loss. They feel vulnerable, they don't fit in. A lot of times, a teenager loss, they could be the only person in their classroom at school who has experienced that particular kind of loss. So they feel like they stick out as a sore thumb. So, a primary question is who can I trust? So, establishing that trusting relationship. I'm going to pick you up from school on time. You never thought it mattered all that much, but after grandma died, picking you up from school on time actually really matters because it triggers all kinds of other emotions. I'm going to be there to help you with your homework or to listen to you when you want to talk late at night. These very basic kinds of parenting and coaching and supportive moves create that foundation of trust so that when your student has a deeper question about grief or loss, maybe it's a question about their body, a question about relationships, a question about addictive behavior, you've already created and are creating this safe space in which to ask those questions. Because if you sit down with your kid and say, hey, have you felt tempted to vape since grandma died? He's probably not going to give you the answer that you're hoping for. In the same way that if you sat down and had a one and done birds and the bees conversation with your teenager, he might be looking for the door. And so it's a slow work. It's a very slow work, but it's a worthwhile work because we know that teenagers have said over and over, there have been multiple studies that say teenagers believe that a person who shows up for them for the long haul is the most supportive element in making their grief something both survivable and something from which they can thrive.
I think that's really important, the showing up again and again and being willing to have those conversations as many times as you have to
Mhm.
and cover whatever ground that might look like. It's not a one and done thing.
Yeah.
As uncomfortable as it might be to continuously revisit certain topics,
Uh-huh.
that is what's necessary.
Yeah.
So this book, I love the layout of the book. It completely blew me away. I felt like a true handbook.
Mhm.
It's divided into topics, and then within the topics, there are like your questions answered. There are lists with tips. There are quizzes so you can understand exactly how you're feeling or what might be going on with your body. Or as you provide the story or the teaching concept, how do I fit into that? And I thought that was so brilliant and just makes it so accessible. How did you and Fiona arrive at creating the book in this way?
Mm. Well, Fiona and I are good friends, and I feel very honored to say that about my 19-year-old. But I think that her maturity and loss and my parenting journey over the last 5 years has produced a really beautiful relationship for which I'm grateful. And Fiona and I learned one thing over the last few years, and primarily that it was that teenagers don't like talking to their parents.
Mhm.
It's hard to get those conversations going. But teenagers love to talk. They're looking for
Mhm.
community, they're looking for conversation. And so we created this book in a Q&A format because we really want to model the kind of conversations that we believe that teenagers can have with trusted adults in their lives. They can ask the vulnerable questions about sex and emotions and the afterlife and not feel weird in asking those questions. And yet, there are also going to be times where a teenager just wants to find quick information. And I don't want my teenager going to TikTok or to social media to find answers to her questions. I don't want my son Googling on WebMD to read about illnesses. And because we know that students who are searching out information online are more prone to anxiety, they're more prone to social difficulties. I want them to find wisdom from trusted voices. And so when Fiona and I were looking to build out this book, we included the trusted words of students who shared their own experiences after loss so that as a reader took a look at it, they could see their own experience reflected in someone else's words. And we added those things like quizzes and Q&A with the hopes that this would be a handbook that students would stick it under their pillows, dog ear, underline, highlight, go back to it over and over again to the particular sections that really resonated with them, that could offer them the support, the customized support that they really needed.
I felt that as I was going through it. It felt like wherever you might be in your grief journey, you can kind of open to a spot in this book that's going to meet you where you are and give you the information that you need and help you make sense of what's going on with yourself. My grandmother, she died right after I graduated high school. And
Mhm.
up until going through what I'm going through with my mom, she's been the loss of my life. She helped raise me. And I can remember, even though I was on, the older side of the teenage spectrum, just feeling so confused and mixed up about so much of what's going on. Like the sleep patterns are disrupted, your eating patterns are different, like things that you wouldn't necessarily associate with grief until you've had that education or experience.
Mhm.
And this book kind of lays it all out, like whatever, if you have an urge to act out in a certain way or cope in a healthy versus unhealthy way. And it's all there. And it's written in a way that feels so accessible. And I absolutely loved that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Adrian. And, it's interesting. You talk about your grandmother. And I think for a lot of students, someone elderly in their life is their first loss.
Mhm.
It is a deep tragedy when students lose their peers, when they lose a parent or a sibling. Uh, but, there are a lot of students for whom an elderly person is their first loss. And I think our narrative in culture is she lived a long life, or grandma's no longer in pain. We have this kind of language for people who have lived a long time that can make it really difficult for teenagers who are experiencing that as their first loss because there's a lot of, grandpa's at peace now. And
Mhm.
and maybe these things are true. Maybe grandpa did live a really long life and after years of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's he is at peace. Maybe grandma's I you know, her pain on earth is done, and that's something that for which we are so grateful. But it sort of belies a resolution that students don't actually feel and experience in their bodies. And so it can be really confusing. We think of a loss that disrupts the normal chain of events as confusing for a student. It's really confusing when they lose a fellow soccer player on their team or they lose a sibling, but it's actually equally as disruptive for students to lose an older person in their life because of the kind of language that we use when we're talking about elderly deaths. And so, this book is designed for the spectrum of those losses
Yes.
because even a student who has watched a beloved great aunt or uncle live a long and happy life may still experience the sleep disruptions and the eating disruptions, the distraction at school, all of these things, and wonder, how do I reconcile this with all of the adults around me who are saying, she's at peace now? I don't feel at peace. And I think that's where, what we've tried to create here, I sense it will be helpful for students in whatever kind of loss they face, because they've got one leg in childhood and one in adulthood. And it's a lot to navigate, whatever that loss is the first time you have it.
And I think this book does such an amazing job of, like I said, meeting them where they are, but giving them that information where they can understand what's going on with themselves. And it doesn't, what I loved, and I felt, at least as a teenager, sometimes like people are talking down at me or
Yes.
talking to me like I can't possibly understand
Mhm.
what they're trying to explain, even though I understood it full well. And I feel like this book, it doesn't do that. It gives you the information in a way that treats you like the competent, intelligent person that you are while making it so understandable at the same time.
Yeah. Someone asked me recently, they said, "Now, is this a book for parents or is this a book for teens?" And I was like, "Okay, well, this is a book for teenagers. Fiona and I wrote it specifically for those who are 13 to 18 and then sort of,
Mhm.
those on the edges of that age range." But I said to them, I was like, "It wouldn't hurt parents to read it too." Because I think what you're saying is so true. Like we know as adults we have a lot of things that we presume we don't have the language to interact with kids in a way that feels authentic and real. And so, yeah, it wouldn't hurt for parents to sort of look over the shoulder, for coaches or school counselors to look over the shoulder and be like, okay, what are the things that students want to know, and how do I set up the conversation so that we can talk about these in a way that feels genuine to them?
I would say, having read the book, anybody that has a teen in their life, whether
Mhm.
it's they're parenting them, they're an aunt, they're an uncle, like you said, a coach, if you work in that capacity where you're the trusted adult, I would say read it because it is going to give you an entry point to some maybe difficult, uncomfortable conversations and give you the language that allows you to talk to that teen in your life in a way where they don't feel dismissed. They don't feel like you're treating them like they don't understand. It really does provide the language for the adult to reach the teen. And if you're the teen that picks it up, it gives you just a complete understanding of what's happening that you may not have the language for yet.
Yeah, that's very true. I had a woman that I was talking to this week, and she said, she lost her brother when she was a teenager, and she said, reading this book, reading Hurt, Help, Hope, made me feel like a teenager again. And I think that for those of us who are adults who experienced a first loss in our teen years, there's probably still a lot that went unprocessed in that time, and so it's helpful to kind of think through your own inner child, like what did I need to hear, and how could I have received care? I think this can be a resource that's helpful in that way as well.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's not a bad idea to, like I said, if you're in that capacity where you work with kids in that age, even if one of them is not going through this now, picking up this book and kind of understanding what they'll be facing when that does happen. I think it's like mandatory reading to me because I feel like I didn't get some of those conversations or that understanding. I had a few friends that had died when I was a teenager as well. Like the biggest one was definitely my grandmother, and some other family members died when I was younger, but I just feel like this book would have reached me in a way that I know I was not reached at
Mhm.
that time. So, what was it like to co-author a book with your daughter? I know you're both great friends, but I would imagine that might have been difficult, especially kind of wading through some of the complicated topics or making some of the decisions, like the resources and the lists, and say like the movies. How do you come to an agreement on what to include versus not include? That dynamic fascinated me. Both of you working together to put it together.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun, and, she became a better writer, I became a better writer, she cut all the cheesy phrases out of my writing, which was good. She would sometimes mark the document and say, "Mom, people don't talk like that." Like, "Oh, okay, okay, that's good." And when it came to the movies, we had a great time because we had a whole, block of movies that we were trying to review together to see, like, okay, which movies would be really, really good at encountering for a student to encounter some of the themes here, but wouldn't sort of push them over the edge, because a
Yes.
a movie is a very visceral experience, it's sensory, and so we wanted these to be good resources for them. So there were nights where I'm on one laptop in one room and she's on a laptop in another room, and we're watching different movies or we're texting each other like, "Oh, this isn't gonna be a good one. Okay, we're gonna stop. We're gonna go to the next one." So I know that our movie intake intake really skyrocketed for a little while there as we were figuring out what we wanted to share. But yeah, each of the I mean, this is the amazing piece that it wasn't like she wrote one section and I wrote the other section. I mean, certainly as we were working on it together, there were certain initial phases where we did that, but there was so much cross pollination and editing, and every single resource there has her fingerprints and mine together on it. So when students look at it, I hope they see the authenticity of a teenager's voice in that space, because that's certainly, yeah, she was a part of every single page of that book.
I love it. And the resources, again, it's really meeting people where they're at. Like there are playlists,
Mhm,
there's books, there's a grief relief toolkit. I mean, ways to honor the person that you lost, ways to kind of honor their memory or create a memory book, like
mhm,
just very whatever project you want to work on or whatever you're needing. Like I said, if it's you're like I want to read, like as a kid I was a huge reader. That was the
mhm,
thing that I turned to before everything else. Like having a list of books that would
mhm,
help me kind of work through this, process it or understand it, that's huge. And I feel like for whatever way you process things or whatever modality you turn to kind of work through the difficult things, whether it's music, movies, novels, or you're looking for a creative project, it's all in there.
yeah.
And I, like I said, I was just like giddy reading it. I was like, I wish I had this.
Oh, thank you.
How did that impact your relationship? I would imagine it brought you closer together, or even the healing journey. Maybe brought up things that weren't covered before, or maybe
Mhm.
you understood her in a different way, or vice versa.
Yeah, I it certainly when you have to take a topic that's so intimate and so personal and really dissect it on the table to be able to figure out what is important to share with someone else, you do veer into territory that you hadn't before. And I think one of the best things that came out of those conversations as we were developing the content for the book and writing it was just an awareness for me that she knew that I had screwed up a lot. And, I think it's one of those things that we fear our children knowing in grief. Like, we just wanna say all the right things. We want to, especially when we see a child who is grieving, there's a sense in which I just don't want anything bad ever to happen to you again. Like, you've experienced the worst. I want you to make every soccer team, get a role in every play. I want you to get a good grade on every test and have friends without conflict forever and ever. Amen. I just want to bubble wrap you from all of the world's pain. And I think our instinct to protect as parents, as adults in children's lives is a natural one. It's a good one. And yet it's also a little bit misguided because we can't do those things. And I think realizing, okay, she knows all the places where I screwed up and she loves me anyways. She realizes how hard this has been to navigate, to guide our family, that she's had grace for me, that she's forgiven me when I needed it. I think that was a really precious part of our interaction over the content of the book because, yeah, I learned new things about her. She learned new things about me, but it was that connection, despite brokenness, that I really feel was a treasure for us in that season.
I think whether you're a parent or not, it's important just to take the pressure off because you're gonna screw it
Yes.
up. Like,
Yeah,
you just
that's right.
are. Like, if somebody is grieving, you're not gonna say the right thing. Like, you
Yep.
can't take away the pain, and you may not realize it when you're in it, but when you look back, you're like, "Oh, probably wasn't the best approach," but that's just the reality of the like, nobody knows how to do this, and even if you've done it before, every loss is so different.
Yes.
And every relationship is so different, and it brings in all of these different dynamics that maybe you thought, well, if I did it this way this time that would be better, and it's like, still not quite right.
Yeah.
Like, but if you could just take the pressure off, that's part of the battle, I think. Like, don't expect yourself to do everything right.
Yeah, and that's one of the beauties of seeing our relationship with, students, with children as a long-term one. I don't have to get it right now, because there were times as we talked through things, as we were preparing content, where I had to apologize then. "Hey, now that you describe it, that was a really lousy response I had, when you were crying and I told you to buck up. Or, like I must have been at the end of myself, or I read the situation wrong. And to be able to reflect together on the ways that you have fumbled the ball in the past, I think is just this is an ongoing relationship that you're building with a student over time, and you may not have done it right in the moment, but as you maintain that relationship through the rocky times over time, Lord willing, you come to a place where you can still have those kind of honest conversations where you get a chance to reflect and make things right. And we know that teenagers value authenticity. And so rather than trying to look like you have it all together, um, they're far more open when you're willing to acknowledge your fallibility.
For her to have the opportunity to have these conversations with you too is,
Mhm.
I think, really special, and just kind of like laying the cards on the table,
Yeah.
acknowledging what went great, what didn't, and becoming closer and stronger because of that. I
Mhm.
think that's really special. So between the two of you, I'm sure maybe there's some difference on some level, being different age, different experience going through the loss of Rob, but somebody that picks up this book, a teen, and they're grieving, maybe they feel isolated, alone, what is your greatest hope that they will get from this?
Mhm. My greatest hope would be for that student. I would say to that student, what has happened to you does not define you. What has happened to you does not define you. It marks you. You will carry the loss of your person, the love that you had for your person, the pain of their absence. You will carry that for the rest of your life. And that is as it should be, because the people that we lose and love, we feel their absence because they were precious. They were a treasured gift to us. And yet, you are not alone in this. You will grow as you face your grief with honesty and self compassion. Uh, to say you'll get through this seems to indicate that someday you'll get beyond it. But the reality is that you will learn to live with grief as your companion. And what you will find over time is that grief, it it is a love that will enrich your life as it gives you a long-lasting connection to the person that you lost, and it will enrich your life as you learn to understand the woundedness of the world around you. One of the things that, Fiona will often say to me is that while she wishes that dad never would have died, she realizes that experience has given her understanding of the pain that other people feel. And I think it's so true. There is a uniqueness to our loss that can feel isolating at times. Nobody knows what I've been through. Nobody understands. I'm all alone in this. And it is true. I can't step into your loss of your grandmother any more than you can step into my loss of my husband. There is a uniqueness to that is just defies the understanding. And yet there's a universality to our loss where you can share your story and it brings tears to my eyes. I can share my story and it gives you that same familiar ache of missing your person. And I think this is something that students can learn to receive as deep wisdom and as a hidden gift in their grief. That in a world where isolation and loneliness mark so much of our culture, where people are craving community, the authenticity with which they show up in the world, having experienced these things that are far beyond their years, the wisdom that they bring to that showing up, is going to be a gift to the world, and it's going to be a gift to them in connection, deep connection with others who have experienced loss. It will give them a deep connection in service and comfort for others. And I think all teenagers are looking for meaning. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for a sense of value for their own lives. And in a bizarre and heartbreaking and incredibly hard but beautiful way, grief can offer that.
I agree. And I think picking up this book will kind of help teens really navigate that, and digest the wisdom and ask those big questions. And if they're already asking them, kind of help them make sense of it. I think when you're willing to, say, read a resource like that and really work through what you're going through in grief, that is where the wisdom is gained, when
Yeah.
you're willing to reflect on it and not run away from it, as hard as that it can be
Mhm.
at times. And I agree. I think that it can change how you show up in the world for the
Mhm.
better, and understanding pain and what that is like, even if you don't know the exact pain. Like you said, there's that familiar ache that comes with grief, that once you go through it, you don't have to have the exact loss to
Mhm.
understand that piece of it.
That's right.
So beyond Hurt, Help, Hope, what future projects and goals are you working on related to grief
Mm.
support?
So I'm really excited. I've got a children's picture book that comes out in the spring. It's based on an old story from my family about my great great aunt who lost a parent when she was a little girl. It is based, takes place on the coast of Maine. It's this beautiful, classic children's book, beautiful art by a talented illustrator, Gretchen Ellen Powers. I'm super excited about bringing that story because it's a story about grief and loss and the love that lasts long after our loved one has gone from us. So I'm super, super excited about that to round out this group of resources that I hope will help individuals and families as they process their loss.
Yeah, I love a resource for children as
Mhm.
well, because wherever somebody is in, in their life, in their age group, tackling grief is, it can be very different at each area. And so having like a story that meets children, that opens up those conversations, that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And when does Hurt, Help, Hope come out as well?
It comes out on October 8th, so pretty soon.
October 8th. Okay.
Mhm.
Yes, and they can get that pretty much wherever books are sold.
Yep, anywhere books are sold.
Perfect. And what are the best ways for people to find you or to work with you?
Mhm.
And I'll include your links and stuff in the show notes.
Yeah, you can visit me at my website, clarissamall.com. I hang out on Instagram also. Love to connect with folks there. And then you can hear me weekly over at the Bulletin Podcast. I'm a producer and moderator of that. It's a news podcast. And it might be surprising that someone who has lost a loved one would have a job in the news. But in as much as grief has taught me anything, it has shown me the woundedness of the world, the brokenness of the world, and how important it is to witness and attend to that. So it's a great honor for me to do that, and I love to hear from listeners, from readers. So you can contact me through my website and get in touch.
Perfect. One thing I love to ask people, because I have found for myself through my different losses that the grieving process is kind of an experimental journey, where
Yeah.
something that may have helped before is not really something I'm open to in this new season.
Mhm.
So, in that spirit, can you share one specific thing that has helped you to grieve, and one specific thing that has helped bring joy back into your life while grieving?
Mm. Well, one specific thing that has helped me to grieve has been getting tattoos, and that might be a bit of a surprise. But
Okay.
yeah, I've got some ink, and I began that process as a way of remembering my husband. And I've talked to a lot of folks who have lost loved ones who are like, I really needed to mark this in a way on my
Mhm.
body um, so that I could see it all the time, so that I could remember. Some folks want to do something that's obvious so that other people can understand their loss, and for some, it's just a quiet reminder. But that has been something that sort of surprised me. I don't like needles, but I'm hooked now. So has been one thing that helped me in my grief. I think another thing that has brought me joy, and Fiona and I write about this in Hurt, Help, Hope. We instituted Whoopie Pie Thursdays when
Yes.
we were in the first year after Rob's death. Every Thursday, I would pick my kids up at school and we would head straight over to a little local general store that had a bakery, and we would buy whoopie pies. They're a classic New England dessert, and just about as big as your hand, cream filled, so delicious. And it was just a weekly celebration that we'd survived. Like, hey, we've made it to Thursday. The weekend's almost here. We did it, guys. And I think in so many ways, it's those little pleasures that help you to claw your way to joy again. Those intentional moments of saying, "Hey, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna celebrate like it was my birthday, like it was Christmas time, and it's only Thursday." Those kind of rituals have been the foundation of finding joy in our life together, and I'm really grateful for them.
I love that you share that because I actually highlighted that section. I thought
Ah,
that between the consistency and like the having something to look forward to, that
yes.
like this Thursday, I'm going to have that bright spot no matter what else happens.
Mhm.
Like that is going to be a thing that I'm going to have with my kids, and it's going to be happy and joy filled. And I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time and sharing your experience with us. It has been an absolutely incredible conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. That's it for today's episode, my friends. Thanks so much for joining me on the Living with Loss podcast. Please like and follow the show so you don't miss an episode. If you're looking for more grief support, grab my free guide, 5 Essential Tools for Immediate Relief from Grief, even if you don't think that's possible. Head on over to adriancrowley.com and download it. Remember, you may not have chosen all the changes or losses in your life, but you get to choose what happens next. New episodes drop every Wednesday. Until then, have a fantastic week.